Hello, techies. You're listening to another episode of Tech Society, a bi-weekly podcast with the founders of Ninja Software and unapologetic technocrats, Alex Dunmo and John Newman.
Hey techies, welcome to another episode of Tech Society. Today we have the great pleasure of speaking with Peter Newman. Peter is an environmental scientist, author, and the professor of sustainability at Curtin University. In this episode, we cover his strong views on climate change and the new industrial revolution, better environmentally friendly alternatives for fuel, such as lithium or hydrogen, and how, in spite of the very real existential distress caused by environmental change, we are beginning to take the right steps towards a better future. Hi, Peter.
Oh, good day.
G'day. How's it going?
Pretty good.
All right, well, let's just jump right in then. Do you want to give us your kind of standard introduction as to who you are and what you do?
And what you believe in.
Yeah, and I'd love to dig into activist academic, which I really enjoyed that title.
Okay, I'm Peter Newman. I'm a professor of sustainability at Curtin University. Other roles, I am the coordinating lead author for transport in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN body. I run transport for the world, just as a small sideline. Over the years, I have played a role as an activist academic in essentially standing up for the things I strongly believe in, as well as writing the papers and books that are necessary to substantiate that. So I've written 20 books and 350 academic papers, and I spent most of the last 6 months in the COVID lockdown writing the biggest papers I've ever done, because I had the time to do it, and instead of being the activist who was constantly going to public meetings. So I enjoy that combination of things that can both be involved in change as well as write and research about it.
So let's jump right into COVID-19 and its impact on climate change and the next industrial revolution, which can I just assume is technology focused? The next industrial.
It is technology focused, and I sometimes get criticised for that, because there are people who think we just need a revolution, or we just need to put a carbon tax on, or we just need to do something like stop population growth, or there's always
easy
something
like that.
that's simple, and they say technology's simple. It's not.
No.
Technology is a whole system that incorporates not just markets and how you get it through a system and how you finance it and how you make it something that is brandable and sellable, and then it has to fit the culture and all of that. And essentially it's about civilization, because civilization doesn't happen without technology, and you can go back in history to show how that's changed. So what I've done in this new paper of mine, it's called COVID, Cities and Climate, is to look at how economic collapses have led to innovation in technology, and that this has then swept into being the basis of the new economy. Now that's a process that you can go back to in 5 or 6 waves of innovation that have been examined by economists like Kondratiev, who was a Russian in the 1920s, Schumpeter, who was a British and German, I'm not quite sure where his origins were, but he certainly wrote a lot in English in the 1930s. And he and Kondratiev came up with these long waves of innovation theory, which is pretty much accepted and has been worked on ever since. And I came across it 30, 40 years ago, and I thought, wow, a lot of this green stuff we're talking about, it's going to come, but in the next wave of innovation, when the other ones all fall away, And so I've been sort of waiting for this time and hoping for it. But, you don't really like to think that you reckon this is the great time of the future, but in many ways it is.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of pain and suffering and death, but at the same time, Schumpeter called it creative destruction. The old order is vanished in a way. It just fades away because the investments that were there in propping up the old order, and the old order for the fourth wave of innovation was really about coal-fired power stations, oil refineries, car manufacturing, plastics, all the things that we know consume fossil fuels and in the end create this climate change problem we've got.
Yes.
So how do you get a systemic change that gets rid of all that? Well, you have a major economic collapse and all of their industries are suddenly not viable any longer. And that's what we're seeing. Amazing acceleration in the alternatives. So I could go through and tell you what I see as the alternatives, because in each of these waves of innovation, whether it was the first one that came after the 1840s and gave rise to railroads and steel and cotton, or after the 1890s, which gave rise to electricity. We hadn't had that before, and huge innovations and trams and electric trains. And then the 1930s gave rise to this innovation series we're part of now. And the high-tech stuff came after a collapse in the 1980s, which was not that deep. And so it's come in, but the big innovations of the fourth wave that I've talked about, they are still clearing out. And so the evidence that I've put together in this paper, which is in a journal called Urban Science, and there's a free journal, you can download the paper, and there's a shorter version of it in the conversation, it's called "Is COVID Accelerating the Demise of Fossil Fuels?" Well, the answer to that is yes.
Yes.
And the first data on it show that a massive decline in all the OECD countries in coal-fired power just in this period. So 24% reduction in just a few months in coal usage and a 22% increase in renewable energy. So why is that happening so quickly? It's happening because renewable energy has no marginal costs. The fuel is free. So when you set up a utility that's got available to it renewable energy or coal or gas turbines as that goes, and you've got a big reduction in demand, then the system moves to where the least cost is, and that's for renewables. And the others are all just fading away. Now, some of them will come back, but the reality is once you turn them off, they're very hard to get back on again, and they start deteriorating quicker. So the end is in sight for coal and gas and certainly diesel in terms of those power systems. Now, the same thing we can see happening in electric vehicles. All of this depends on batteries as well. Batteries in the vehicles and batteries in the power system. And we had something very significant happen in Australia, which was the 150 megawatt Tesla battery system that was put in South Australia.
Yes.
That paid for itself in 2 years.
Yeah.
And especially in the last 6 months. So,
which is nothing from an infrastructure investment perspective.
And why did it happen so quickly? Because batteries have an ability to handle fluctuations in the power system. In a millisecond. They can go into the system. Whereas gas-fired gas turbines, which were the main other way of doing it, they take 6 seconds to come back on. So the system was just moving very quickly towards the batteries. and it was used up fully, and the gas turbines are sitting there. So we can now see we don't need gas turbines. We don't need coal-fired power. We just need solar, wind, and batteries. Yes. The system can handle all the rest of it can fade away. Mm-hmm. Now, it's taken COVID to show us that. Now, the electric vehicles are coming on very rapidly. They've got huge market share in the last 6 months. Tesla's now become the highest share with the highest share value, replaced Toyota. Most car sales were down, but electric vehicles took a very big market share. Mm. And the micro-mobility, which is electric scooters, electric skateboards, electric bikes, they just took off. You couldn't get them. Everybody wanted one just because you could go locally on that. So COVID has helped in those major 3 transitions. Now, the fourth part of that transition, which I call smart city technologies, is how they are integrated. Because we still need to make a grid work. We still need to have electric vehicles that fit into that grid and don't ruin it, but actually help it. Yes. What time do they recharge? Where do they recharge? How do you get batteries that support the whole system? All of that is handled by these smart city sensors, artificial intelligence, and blockchain, which has been shown in Western Australia to be the best way to share solar. Mm. So we've got a package called a cluster of innovations.
Yes.
Now we know what they are, and they're incredibly cheap now, and they're incredibly better.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't they just sweep in and take over and provide for us the solutions we've been looking for?
That's right. It's a lot easier to transport electricity than it is fuel, like fossil fuels. And you're far less likely to dump it on the ocean. So I think the changes will happen very fast over the next decade. It's interesting that COVID has triggered that. Do you think that is because all of a sudden we were just using those old technologies? We just weren't using them very much, so we've kind of reduced their market value.
Yeah, well, the 4 groups of technologies that I've said have been sitting there and needing to be mainstreamed in order to get the mass production that brings down their costs even further. They were mass produced in China mostly. China was prepared to have a go at that, and the whole world's benefited from solar and batteries because of that. The electric vehicles, they've been mass producing, but they haven't been exporting. So it's time for that to start to happen. And in many ways, the whole system has been to prop up the old coal, oil, gas systems and to provide all kinds of incentives for them.
Yes.
And it's very hard to stop that. But when their share market drops, the prices drop, you can't get investors to put money into them. Governments say, oh, okay, let's move with the new.
Anymore. Yeah.
And so that's the era we're going into. And just quietly, they're going to fall away, hopefully. But if governments want to get in the way and say, oh, we're going to pour money into a gas-fired recovery, which we've set up a committee at federal level to do.
Yes.
But gas-fired recoveries still need investment. And if the investors don't want to do it, it'll die. Mm-hmm. So it's a desperate sort of thing. And all it'll do is make us uncompetitive. Whereas we have a chance to be fabulously out in front because we've got the solar, we've got batteries, we've got electric vehicles potential, people like innovation, and we could just set up our cities to run on all that very, very quickly.
We also have plenty of lithium.
Yeah. I get asked that question frequently. Even on the IPCC, they say, oh, but surely we're going to run out of lithium. So, lithium's a crustal element. It's everywhere. But in Western Australia, we have the biggest lithium mine in the world. And they say, no, you haven't. Lithium comes out of Bolivia. And they're going to put up an OPEC type. Okay, come on. That was when they made lithium out of salt lakes high up in the mountains, the very, very salt-rich lakes. And they're still making some, but hard rock lithium has taken over, and it is cheaper, and it makes lithium carbonate, which is easy to convert into lithium hydroxide, which is a very highly processed and available element. Now, we're making that and processing that in Western Australia. We are the world's biggest provider of it.
Yeah.
So, we're likely to be providing the world with their lithium-ion battery metals, even rare earths as well.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that needs to be provided well, but we also need to process it here and recycle it here and do all of those things as well, and we can.
So I've got your article up here, Lithium Valley, establishing the case for energy metals and battery manufacturing in Western Australia. I love that, Lithium Valley. I've not heard that before. But I think as soon as you kind of make an analogy to Silicon Valley, people get it. Like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And bringing focus to the battery as the central component of that change to renewables, I think, is important.
Very important. We have the opportunity to be the California of the future economy, and that we will have thousands and thousands of people and jobs coming here because we've got those minerals. Why not process them locally and do it in a way that's clever?
Yeah.
So we now have a CRC in future battery industries established with that as the goal, that we would help create the California of the new economy here. And they're working away on new innovations that can help do that. Mm-hmm. So, I'm hopeful that we can do that in Western Australia. And there are other things we can do with hydrogen out in the regions. I haven't mentioned that because hydrogen is essentially what Ross Garnaut has said we should be doing with our iron ore, our aluminium, our cement. These three products, major pollutants of the atmosphere, because they all take gas or coal in order to provide a reducing agent as well as the heat that's needed to process them. And fossil fuels can do both. Well, hydrogen can do both. It is a reducing agent and it can provide the heat. So the problem with hydrogen is you need a lot of space to produce it, and you need solar farms and wind farms that can then be used to break down the water and create the hydrogen. Yes. But you need it right there on the spot.
Yeah.
So you need a place where you're producing the iron ore or the aluminium or the cement, which is got lots of space around it and lots of sun. Oh, that sounds like the Pilbara.
I've read a few times that when you start working with hydrogen, the issue is transport of the hydrogen after you've created it, and storage as well. So do you think there's actually room for the lithium and hydrogen valleys to work together in terms of generating hydrogen and using battery technologies locally to store the hydrogen?
Well, it is possible to think that way, and that's the way the Japanese have put it, that there would be an electric grid with lithium-ion batteries and solar and wind feeding it, and there will be a hydrogen grid, which would be essentially producing hydrogen and putting it into all kinds of things, transport and industry and everything. The problem is this: you need a lot more space and a lot more energy to make hydrogen. So why not use the power you've created directly, just straight into the function you need it for, whether it's power or transport with batteries. Why do you need the hydrogen? You don't. It's actually just making it very expensive. But there is no solution with lithium-ion batteries for industry. Those industrial processes need a reducing agent as well as power or heat, and they going to need hydrogen. So I just think they should focus on that and not see the hydrogen economy as being everything else. It's a bit like an ideology, a little bit fundamentalist. Hydrogen economy, that will take over everything. You won't need even lithium-ion batteries. And, you know, it's like, oh my gosh, no, lithium-ion batteries have won.
It feels
hands down.
It feels like they're just trying to replace petrol. They see the way petrol works and they think, well, let's just swap that.
Yeah, there's a bit of that. You just sort of whack it in the system, and you know, I think it would be a diversion, and in many ways, the gas industry in particular, but oil also, will be quite happy to have the hydrogen economy being seen as the solution, because that's not going to happen quickly. That's going to happen very slowly. We've got a long way to go on that. Whereas lithium-ion batteries and solar and wind, they can happen right now. Get rid of coal, get rid of diesel, get rid of gas. We don't need them.
On that,
the final and that's 80% of the carbon. Yeah. The last 20% is those industrial processes that need hydrogen. So let's push them out a little bit, but keep the ones that you know work.
Yeah.
You've spoken about the fourth wave of innovation, which is the fossil fuels. I guess we're looking at the fifth wave here, which is the renewables.
No, this is the sixth.
The sixth, is
sixth
it?
Wave. Sixth great
wave.
wave.
Yeah, we call it the sixth because the fifth. The fifth one was those smart technologies.
Digital transformation.
So what kind of time frame are we looking at? You make it sound like it's happening right now, but on a...
This is definitely the start of the...
Yeah, but I want to know how fast the shift is going to be. So do you have any predictions about everything solar or everything electric? When is that going to happen?
Well, if you'd asked me this time last year, I would have said 2040 is the year we should be, talking about 80% less, and 2050 100%. The IPCC goal is 100% by 2050. So coming back, it has to be phased in, and it was hard to see it phasing in as quickly as it is now. What I'm seeing is that we could have 80% there by 2030. That is how quickly it can be. This decade will see a rapid acceleration, and there will be countries that will be left behind in that process. But I think there are many developing countries that can leapfrog into it. There will be many emerging countries like China and Korea and Brazil, those kind of places that can, if they wanted to, put their major growth phase, which they're now going through, and India as well, into that transition. There's a lot of African countries that'll need to leapfrog from virtually nothing into this new technology, and it works very quickly and easily. It's like the mobile phones. They didn't have to have landlines. They just went straight to mobile phones.
Yeah.
Well, they can go straight to solar, wind, batteries, and electric vehicles, and they will benefit from it. The hard ones are going to be the economies that are so dependent, like America. And they're really finding this change hard. Trump was elected to bring back coal.
Yeah.
How well has he done in that? 50 coal-fired power stations have closed down in the years that he's been under control. He has no ability to stop this. And they're finding it hard. The change is happening too quickly. There's so much that they're scared about, and you don't embrace the future if you're fearful and scared like that, and that's the problem.
So this tumultuous presidency is almost due to the death throes of a dying industry, then?
Very much the death throes, and Biden has got it. Obama had it as well, but they weren't able to fully do it because they didn't have control of the Congress, but also they just politically difficult, because just imagine the oil industry, the coal industry, the gas industry in America, they're so powerful. And of course the motor vehicle manufacturers in Detroit and others, that they don't want to change.
No,
they
were fighting it.
Vehicles coming out until they were forced to do it.
Yes.
Forced by Californian legislation, not by federal legislation. And, so there are always good signs in America at lower levels, in cities and states, but it is the dying throes of those industries, and it is a creative destruction. We shouldn't be seeing it as entirely something that's negative. It is, in fact, the birth pangs of the new era.
And what about our own Prime Minister coming into Parliament with a brick of coal? Well, I just think he regrets it now. I think it was not a clever thing to do, and he will find that his grandchildren will chide him and say, what the heck were you doing? This is like saying the dinosaurs have got a future. Yes, well, they haven't. And Tony Abbott was the worst part of that. Tony Abbott stopped all of the progress we were making on the decarbonising front, but he's gone, and the same thing will happen to any politician who wants to try and bring back that old world, because it is dying very rapidly now. And so do you see the rise of a, let's say, lithium and renewable energy powered industry becoming just as strong as the BPs and BHPs and all these large companies? I would say they're the status quo right now. Do you see that industry kind of, I guess, in the same way the technology industries became dominant in the fifth wave, the sixth wave will bring on new massive companies that will wield the same kind of power?
Yeah, they might. They might be different. It hasn't taken Tesla very long to get to being a big company with a lot of power, but they're still not making much money. So, I think you might find that they'll break up into smaller sections. But I think the interesting thing is this collection of this cluster of innovations works very well at a small scale as well as a big scale.
Yeah.
So it's modular, so you can just scale it up.
You don't need that same large logistics control, right? Like the old industries required.
The coal and oil was controlled because it works best at a bigger scale.
Yeah.
You needed highly geared, highly financed big companies to pull it off. Now, whether or not we can have a multitude of smaller ones that adapt for the particular needs of each part of the city, each part of the regions and countryside, each remote settlement and so on, can have their own little company or cooperative or whatever that manages these things. It really is going to depend on how all that politics works out. But I think the common good outcomes, which is always necessary to negotiate in any of these eras, will determine that. And we might find it easier to bring it down to smaller scale groups of companies that are linked together in a loose way across the grid or across the system. But each of them would have their own role to play. And that's going to be a combination. You see, I think that city centre is going to be different to the inner and middle suburbs, the outer suburbs, again, different, the regions, the rural villages and so on. They're going to have different solutions, but they're different combinations of those technologies.
In terms of the people, we're talking a lot about industry and how it's going to push things forward to the next wave. But how does the average person help make this happen?
Very good question. I was asked that this morning because I was on Radio National Life Matters, and they had Craig Rucastle on, and Craig is got this wonderful show called Fight for Planet A. And he has a series of households that he's examining to see how they could change from being highly consuming of fossil fuels to being carbon neutral. That's their goal, to try and see how each of these 5 households, they're very different ones, could make that transition. At the same time, he's looking at the gas industry, the oil industry, plastics, coal, the big systems as well. So he's not trying to say it's one or the other. He's trying to say you need to do both.
Yeah.
And the thing that sends the signal to the finance community that the big boys are going to have to change is when so many smaller people are making that change themselves. So we're going through it in my household. We've put PVs on the roof. We've got a heat pump now, which is highly efficient. We're getting an induction cooker, and that'll mean we get rid of gas altogether.
Yep.
No more gas, no more coal. We'll be essentially able to produce a household that's carbon neutral. Now, every time that happens, and it is happening increasingly, that sends a signal, a market signal, that is the future, because it works. It's cheaper. It pays for itself. And our research in the last 5 years at CUSP has been essentially to show that. So Josh Byrne has been working with us, the guy from Gardening Australia. His house, Josh's house.com.au, is one of the biggest hit websites in the world, because he's set up his house to show how to do it and given all of the information away, all the plans of how he built his house and how it works. And it's both energy and water, waste, food production, and electric vehicles, how they fit together.
Yeah.
And he does it well. He then was put to work to try and show how developers could do it. And he found that it took his household to 9 years to pay off the gear to do it.
Nothing.
When he did it with the developers, 6 years. That's all.
Wow.
And you're carbon neutral. We've then went to White Gum Valley and developed it on a 100-unit site where they could share solar. It worked there. We now know how to do it. We're going to go to a 1,000-unit site around the East Village, and after that, a 10,000-unit site. So
fantastic.
We're gearing up, scaling up, and it all comes from the fact that the individual can do that. Now, the other thing that I mentioned on this Newcastle Radio National show was the journal, the magazine, Renew. It's a magazine produced in Australia by all the people who are doing individual things in their house to bring about a reduction in carbon, or not just reduction, but banishing their carbon.
Yeah.
It's an amazing journal. It's been going since 1980, produces little videos, and there are 250,000 a year who use that magazine to help them make choices across Australia. Different climates, different cities, country, region, edge of city, central city, apartments, renters. It's all done. Brilliant stuff.
I think that's renew.org.au, isn't it?
Yep.
Renew magazine.
That's the brand they have for the Australian and the Appropriate Technology Association. Is their formal. They're a charity, not for profit. And, I think it's fantastic what they do, because they have demonstrated over a period how to struggle with those issues and then get it right and show people how to do it. We're now winning. We are now showing the financiers of the world, many of whom go to that site and fix up their own homes that way. Janet Holmes-a-Court's son, Peter Holmes-a-Court, is one of the key people in that group. Yeah. He's got a lot of money, he knows how to invest, and he knows where the future lies now.
Efficiency.
That's the way we can change the world. It's one step at a time, but those small steps are suddenly accelerating.
Yeah.
They're helped by the COVID system. And that's why I think it's very important that we get that message out. It's a very hopeful message, isn't it? It's not like we're saying, not only have we got this pandemic, but we've got climate change, which seems impossible to fix. Well, look again, folks, it's happening.
So just to kind of wrap things up then, what is your optimistic projection for the future of our species? Because we hear about the doom and gloom all the time, and I'm subscribed to a lot of, I would say, almost pro-collapse, people who are fantasizing about the fall of civilization. So
how bad is it going to get?
Just judging by our conversation, you feel quite optimistic about the future, which is refreshing. So what's your projection? What's your guess for what's going to happen in the next few decades?
Well, let me just tell it to you in a little story, because I could be a science fiction writer, but I don't. I more frequently tell stories. Today I went to the funeral of Brian O'Brien, who was the first head of the EPA in Western Australia. He came in 1971, and he was a NASA scientist, Australian, but he was working with NASA, and he came from there because he thought that all the science he'd learned about the planet was such that he wanted to be able to get down and show how important it was to look after the environment.
Yeah.
And in 1970 was the first Earth Day. That's when I first got the environmental bug, and I realised there were a lot of problems that were out of control, including greenhouse. So it's a long journey. Now, what had been happening for the previous era, or several hundred years in fact, was a kind of exploitative development that assumed the environment. It just said we can get away with it because the earth is so big and resources are never going to run out, and we can do what we like and it'll get absorbed. Well, we soon realized from 1970 on, the world set up these environmental protection authorities everywhere, and we had one. By 1972, we'd said no to the first big major development, and that was Lang Hancock's major aluminium smelter that he was going to build in the Swan Valley. It would have completely obliterated the Swan Valley. Now, that was said no to. Now, you can say that was a major turning point in the history of this state. It was like the Wild West was over, and we had to be much more concerning. The EPA from there, I was on the board of the EPA for a while, 5 years or so, and it was a great experience, because there's no doubt that businesses, big companies, were trying their best to reduce their impact. So we've been through an era where reducing the impact was the main agenda to try and help the environment. And it wasn't enough.
Yeah.
Because reducing the impact, whilst the economy is still growing and people are still having more and more children, and the atmosphere was still getting more and more carbon in it. Plastic was growing in the ocean. There were so many problems still out of control. So we had to learn to flatten the curve. The new phrase, right? We've learned all about the science of flattening the curve. Yeah. We've all become experts in it. Well, the phase that we went through in that period, the 70s on, we've now called sustainable development. And it was about how the world began to reduce impact. Now, to flatten the curve, you've got to go over and down. You've got to actually start regenerating the environment. Yeah. Not just reducing impact, cleaning up the mess. You've got to extract the CO2 from the atmosphere. You've got to take the pollution out of the water and the wastes. We've got to absolutely ban plastics and start creating biodiversity that kind of thing I'm calling regenerative development. So it's the third phase. Now, I believe that the future can be regenerative, so that the more people we have and the more the economy grows, the better will be the environment, not the worse. Now, that future is something that we can only imagine if we get the technology right.
Yeah.
It's got to be really extraordinary technology that can make a huge difference. And I can start to see that now. Regenerative, not just minimizing impact, and certainly not just exploiting the earth. So that's the third phase. I think we're entering that. And I'm pleased to see I've lived long enough to be able to see that start.
Yeah.
And Brian O'Brien was a man who would like to have lived longer, I think, to see it further, but he would have seen that change beginning as well.
Yeah.
And there are many people in my era who really worked hard to try to do better. Well, the agenda is now even higher. We've got to do not just better, but significantly better, transformative.
That's brilliant. I think that's a really good message to end on. Well, there is one thing we always ask a bit of a whimsical question at the end, and we have a standard one now. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with American wrestling or MMA fighting, but everyone has their intro song. So they strut out, show off their ego, and they have their song that's meant to kind of represent them. What would your song be?
I did a podcast to America recently where I had to choose 5 songs, and I chose a really nice song from, what's the name of the, Missy Higgins, who has just been through a climate anxiety issue where she actually had genuine mental health problems, and it was all about climate, and so she's come through that and realised that she has to grasp a different future, and she's created a set of songs around that thing.
Here it is.
Yeah.
Solastalgia.
What's it called?
The album's called Solastalgia.
Yeah,
and there's a bunch
is,
of tracks.
A word invented by a guy in Perth at Murdoch University.
Oh, fantastic!
It is kind of negative because it's saying that we're just full of grief for a future that's unlikely to happen. But I think it's very hopeful to see people come through that anxiety and grasp a different future.
And see hope. Yeah, fantastic. Cool. Really cool. Yeah, that was an excellent answer. All right. Thank you so much, Peter. Yeah, that was excellent. And we didn't have to do much.
Your position is clear, and it's nice to see a hopeful approach to climate change, because everyone's always doom and gloom, and it actually is affecting just people and their psyche in general.
I think what you said about Missy Higgins' album is correct. That existential angst and grief, as she said, or solastalgia means, I think is a good thing because it's a powerful force for change. But I would like us to enter that next phase where we can be very hopeful.
Hopeful, yeah.
Well, I love that you said you can see it now. You couldn't see it before, and then the pandemic kind of nudged things along as well.
And the technology is coming out in the mainstream, not just in labs.
That's cool.
Yep. Well, I think that's pretty clear.
Awesome.
Good.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, us too. That was brilliant.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Peter. Till next time. You've made it to the end of another episode of Tech Society. Thank you for listening. I hope that today's episode has given your nostalgia a brief reprieve. On this day in tech history, September 30, in 1980, Digital, Intel and Xerox released version 1 of the Ethernet specification, known as the Blue Book. Since that time, Ethernet has evolved into the de facto networking standard for local area networks in businesses and in homes. So there you go. And that's it for John and I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Make sure you hit us up on Twitter @TechSociety. Have a good one.